Welcome again to our Prehospital Mass Casualty Triage talk for today. Hopefully you guys will enjoy. And again, always feel free to put up the questions in the chat or the Q&A section. I'll be able to pick them up and I'll be able to answer. So it's as interactive as possible. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask. Dr. Online handles all CPD discussions, and Lily will come in at the end of the presentations, tell you how to get your CPD token. So, but always feel free to just send them an email if you didn't get your CPD tokens, and they'll be able to respond to you. These are common scenes in our country, and road traffic crashes probably constitute the largest burden of mass casualty incidents that we normally have as a country. But we've had multiple pre-hospital mass casualty incidents, whether it's the terrorist attacks or building collapses. I think between terrorist attacks, building collapses, and road traffic crashes, this pretty much covers 95% of our mass casualty situations. And whereas for hospital healthcare providers, you rarely go out in the pre-hospital setting. Once in a while, you may be caught up in this situation. And that's why it's also important for healthcare providers who work primarily in the hospital to understand pre-hospital triage, but also the pre-hospital teams also then to be able to harmonize and all of us being on the same page. There's a lot of theory known around pre-hospital triage. Qua ground, as we always say in Kenyan setting, qua ground is different, but on the ground, a lot of things are not done as textbook or as what you've seen in a textbook. And those are some of the discussions we'll be having today in terms of what is textbook, what's the reality, and what's the direction that we seem to be moving towards in terms of pre-hospital triage. Essentially, we're talking about mass casualty triage. Essentially, triage is an inherent part of any mass casualty response that prioritizes patients. That's the first and most important aspect of any triage process, is prioritizing critically ill and injured patients who need to get their care immediately. So it prioritizes the patients and the care they should receive. So it's not just about prioritizing the patient and saying this one is number one, this number two, number three, number four, but also prioritizes the care they should be given. Should I be giving just normal fluids to run, or should I be reducing attention in pneumothorax? So it's not just about prioritizing patients, but it's also about prioritizing the care that they should receive. All of this is based on the number and type of casualties. So there are multiple aspects. So triage is not just about sorting. There are very many factors that go into triage. And this is what we've been emphasizing in our whole triage series. Triage is not just about sorting patients between 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. No, there are multiple aspects that go into triage. It's prioritizing the patient, prioritizing the care the patients get. So, of course, things like in a mass casualty situation, the priority, remember, is not airway. The priority is stopping catastrophic bleeding. And this has actually dramatically changed a lot of our old ABCs to more stop catastrophic bleeding, and then I'll go through your ABC. So it also prioritizes the care they should get. But again, it's also based on the number and type of casualties. You could have 100 minor injured patients. That's probably not going to be a bad thing. Or you could just have 10 critically injured patients. And that on its own, just the 10 could easily become a mass casualty incident. And they're 100, not necessarily a mass. If they're all just minor injuries, then there's no mass casualty there. Potentially, you can be able to deal with that. So it's also, again, dependent on the resources available. If you are a single provider who's shown up in an accident scene, for example, and you have 10 critically ill and injured patients, that's a mass casualty situation. But if you are 10 ambulances and you showed up to an accident with 10 critical ill patients, that's not necessarily a mass casualty incident. The 10 of you and the 10 patients. So again, there are multiple aspects that go into triage, and the same principles apply in the pre-hospital setting. It's prioritizing patients, prioritizing the care they get. This is again based on the number of casualties, type of casualties, because if you have multiple critically ill patients, you may actually not get to provide any care to the less injured and less critical patients. Then type of casualty, and of course, resources available. If you have nothing, then the whole situation is a mass casualty incident for you because you have nothing. But if there are resources available, you're able to mitigate and reduce the severity of the situation in a pre-hospital setting. So the same principles then apply, of course, even when you're approaching any mass casualty situation in a pre-hospital environment, is how am I prioritizing patients? How many patients are there? What kind of patients are there? What do I have? Or what do we have as a team as we respond to this patient? And also looking at the care that these patients will need moving ahead. So triage is, and I think we've repeated this in probably every presentation, triage is dynamic. So triage is not a snapshot. It's not something that happens once and stops. It's something that is ongoing, and because patients' conditions deteriorate or improve, and you have to adjust then your response accordingly to the situation. And similarly, even in a pre-hospital setting, a patient who initially was potentially not that critically ill now has lost consciousness, and that become then they change condition, and that means you have to change the triage status, for example. Triage is an ongoing process, so you don't really stop triage. I know on textbook it sounds like you first do triage, then you now start planning. No, it's an ongoing process. At every given point, you're prioritizing. Remember, we say you're prioritizing the patients as one, you're prioritizing the care they should receive, you're prioritizing, and this is all again based on the number and type of casualty and the resources available. As more resources become available, then you also reprioritize again. They say it's not a distinct activity, it's something that continuously goes on and starts from the moment you arrive at a scene and potentially continues all the way through until the last patient leaves that scene. It's something that goes continuously. Triage is scalable, meaning again, based on how many resources you have, you can triage for many patients, or you can triage for a few patients. And again, the priorities will be different based on the resources available. So the kind of triaging you'll do for 5 patients, for example, and you are 3 healthcare providers, you can be like, all right, let's just make everyone critically ill, let's take everyone. Versus you have 3 healthcare providers and 100 patients, your triage situation potentially vary accordingly. And again, it has to be flexible, again, adapting to the situation. And so these are the principles of any proper triage system that has to meet essentially some of these criteria. So what are the 4 T's of mass casualty incident triage? Okay. So the good thing, if you know it's triage, then 4 more T's. So triage depends on a provider's assessment and interpretation of the patient's prognosis. Based on that assessment, like what care the patient needs and the estimated likelihood of survival, what is required to deliver that care in terms of time, treatment. So time, we're looking at how much time is required to provide the intervention and how quickly does the intervention need to be initiated to be effective. So there are a lot of interventions that have zero value on the street. So if you're in a mass casualty situation, for example, and the guy has maybe a fractured forearm and they're not actively bleeding, it's not compromised, there's nothing, it's just broken. Spending time putting a sling on that patient, yes, it's an intervention, but is it necessary? How much time are you going to take to put that sling? And is it actually needed for, and is it actually an effective intervention? So time is a critical thing when you're looking at triage in terms of how much time will be required to manage this patient. Do I have enough time, or should we just go? Okay, so and that brings the discussion of, are we doing roadside triage? Are we doing interventions on the field, or are we taking this patient to the hospital? And this decision then is based on this, for example, this 40s. It's a time, okay, how much time do I have before this patient crashes? Is how effective is this intervention? The treater, okay, treater essentially, it means, do I know, or what's the expertise of the healthcare provider? If you don't know how to decompress, for example, a tension pneumothorax, then spending time trying to figure it out on the street may be more time consuming and less effective than trying to get to the hospital. So again, the person who is responding, their competency becomes a factor in as part of the triage process. And then how many resources are required for your treatment? How many resources are required to achieve the desired outcome? Okay, if a patient is actively bleeding in the field, am I going to start 2 IV accesses, start giving blood, even if I have them on the field? Let's assume I'm going to start giving out blood, and are we going to start doing, I mean, you can do everything you can do in the emergency department, you can probably do it out in the pre-hospital environment, but the question is, how many resources will be required? Back to the same time, treatment. So how much time do I have? Do I have the competencies? What treatment will I be? How many resources do I need to give this treatment? And then the last part of it, and this is something that needs to be emphasized a lot, especially around triage, is transport. Okay. Destination hospital choice is a key component of triage. So triage is not just about counting patients, saying you're sick, you're not sick, you're very sick, you're very sick, you're not very sick, and then just go to hospital. Where this patient goes is a key criteria, is a key factor as part of your triage process, because transporting the patient to the wrong hospital, which does not have the right resources, or maybe has the right resources, but at this point it's superbly overwhelmed, then actually is going to cause more harm to the patient. So triage doesn't stop at tagging and color coding patient. Triage stops when you decide this patient is going to this hospital because of this reason, and it's a best choice for the patient based on their condition. So there are sometimes you'll actually say, this patient is not that critically ill, send them to the farthest hospital. But that again is a decision need to be made based on the available resources. So all this, the time treatment, transport play a pivotal role in your decision making around triage. So I know a lot of us have known all the different triage tools, and we'll quickly just jump to the triage tools, but it's not just about the tools. There are a lot of decision making that needs to be made and prioritization that needs to be made outside the tools. The tools are there as a guide, and we'll discuss those as we go along, but there's some key decisions that will need to be made. For example, are we going to spend a lot of time trying to stabilize patients on the ground, or are we just picking them and go to the hospital? If there's no ambulance that's available, no other means of transport available, then you probably will spend more time on the ground, in which case then you'll be doing some interventions. And this is basically because that. But if there's an ambulance hot, ready to go, then it doesn't actually make sense for you to spend time on the ground on non-life-saving interventions. And that's what we'll discuss what life-saving interventions are down the line. But it's more of a load and go situation. And this is, again, remember, we're talking about a mass casualty triage, not just your regular triage, which I discussed, and you can catch those videos. So remember, the 40s, it's time, treatment, transport are key, and the part that's normally forgotten is the transport. And this is where making the decision of which destination hospital the patient is going to is a key component of the triage process. So current triage has multiple challenges. Anyone, and feel free if you're in the pre-hospital environment to add on to the chat, and I'll just read them after this 2 slides or so. You can just bring up some of the challenges that you face on the field, because a lot of us and those who've done mass casualty triage know the theory, but when you get to the ground, that theory goes outside the window, okay? And it's all chaos, as you can see in the scene here. So you can imagine if you are the responder here and you're being told you need to manage this situation here. So as I said, there's time, treatment, transport, and treater, and you are the treater at this point. So how do you manage such a situation? So some of the challenges that pre-hospital triage faces is essentially, the first and foremost, of course, no one follows the protocols outlined. We've all read the protocols, we know the protocols, but when people get to the ground, the adrenaline, the chaos, the confusion, those protocols go out the window, okay? So that's the first thing. And some of the protocols are so complicated in terms of the flow process that are not easy to follow. So most people, yes, will pass the exam in terms of they're asked, tell me about star triage, they'll pass the exam easily. But for ground, when they get to the ground, things are a bit tricky, okay? EMS may not be able to establish what is the traditionally known. There's a triage station, there's a casualty collection point, there's a treatment area, and then I don't know, the green guys are going here. So in this situation, for example, trying to figure this out, and we'll discuss a lot of discussions as why this happens, why this becomes a challenge in a real world environment, is purely because of the environment where you are. Okay, so just for those who can't, this is a bus down there on the top right corner is a river. So this bus had plunged into the river and it's down from a bridge. So now where's your casualty collection point? Where's your treatment area? Or you can see patients are all over and there's a lot of people who've gone in to try and help. So how do you apply your pre-hospital triage tools in such a situation? And then most of the commonly used EMS mass casualty triage do not include a rapid assessment for the presence of truncal penetrating injury. Most of the times what will kill you is a penetrating injury in the truncal area. So most tools don't help you implement this. And then bystanders and self-care, okay? So right now, as you can see in this image, there's a lot of bystanders. How do you use these bystanders? Do they know how to, even do you have the supplies to help them? Even just things like placing tourniquets, for example, okay? I mean, how do you utilize the bystanders? Do we have enough tourniquets to give every bystander and tell them, if you find someone bleeding, just tie it off as quickly as possible? And then, of course, the issue of transport, okay? So there's other vehicles coming in. And so are we going to start doing casualty collection? And they look for, no, it's normally load and go. Pick the bystander will pick up the patient, put them in a vehicle and go. So how, and you are the responder on this situation. Now, do you tell them not to load the patient? Do you tell them what to, because these are the situations on the ground, okay? The theory is good. What we know theoretically is good. Like, yeah, we need a casualty collection point. We need a triage point. We need a treatment area. And then we have ambulance staging area. So a lot of that is the theory. But when we get to the ground, some of these things, and we'll discuss why the situation happens. And then the other thing about destination hospitals may not be the closest hospital. So the proper hospital may not be the one that is nearest. You may have the hospital quite far off, okay, the proper one. And saying, take this patient to the nearest hospital. A patient who is actively bleeding, taken to a hospital that has no theater is just sending them to their grave, because there's nothing that's going to happen there. Okay, if they can't take theater, then there's nothing much that's going to happen there. So that's why I said destination hospital is key part of the triage process. And how do you coordinate this when everyone is picking and loading and going? All right. And then when, as I said, so things like immediate responders, self-care, and a lot of our mass casualty triage learnings are coming a lot from the US where they have kids shooting each other every day. I don't even know. They have a shooting situation, but we've had similar shooting situations and people have bled to death. Yet they were bystander kind of triage challenges in the field. So quickly, let's look at type of incidents, okay? So mass casualty incidents can easily be categorized as either static or dynamic. And how you respond to these incidents is what makes then that determination in terms of what exactly will you prioritize and how will you work. Yes, how will you work on this? So what is a static? What is a dynamic incident? All right. So a static incident essentially is what we potentially will see on the road, where it's a single incident or a single area incident, single scene. There's no immediate safety threat to the providers and to the people out there. And then there's little potential for non-EMS transport in the sense that, well, okay, this is in a setup where there's a lot of EMS services, but in our current situation, most of the time, you have non-EMS transport because an accident will happen and then multiple patients will be taken by private vehicles. But in varied situations, so when you talk about non-EMS transport, you're talking about a situation where a lot of people are finding their way to the hospital by whatever means possible. So the sick, not sick, are looking for other means all over. And a good example is, for example, in Dusit or the Westgate attack, people find their way to hospital some, okay? Not necessarily under direct EMS control, but yeah, so that's more of a dynamic incident. So a dynamic incident is one where there are multiple locations, okay? And the large number of casualties. Yes, the large number of casualties is where it's one of those problems where there is a huge group of people and the incident is continuing continuously and takes some time to be sorted. There is high potential for the rescuers also to need protection, okay? So it could be a live situation. So remember, in many cases, so for example, the static incidents you will manage in a normal way, okay? Go through some triage process and prioritize the care, and we'll discuss more about the management of static incidences as we discuss the details in the triage, in this triage discussion. Access, extraction of the victim and transport are prioritized instead of the more let us assess the patient. A lot of the public will bypass EMS and flee the area, often relying on private transport and law enforcement vehicles to access the hospitals. So, and we find a lot of our situations on the ground right now being quite dynamic, can run to your ambulance and say, oh, I have this cat here, this cat here. So those who have so bulk of the patients will try and incident where most of the people will be approaching you as an ambulance that will be probably ones with minor injuries. Okay. And because of the chaos that comes on, it's very hard to implement your systemic approach of let's first tag all the patients, red, yellow, green, blue, black, and then we go to the next step of clearing. So that whole step processes goes out in a dynamic incident. The need for actually just quick rapid victim access, extraction, and transport the patient. Not lend itself to set up a formal or trying to get all the structures in place that we all know from theory. And that's why it's important to quickly assess as you get to the scene, and we discuss the triage process. As you do your scene size up, am I dealing with a static incident or am I dealing with a dynamic incident? If it's a dynamic, that decision has to be made as soon as you arrive on the scene to realize that. If it's a dynamic incident, then it is get the victim, extract the static incident, then you can go through the formal process of triage, which we'll discuss bits and pieces of. So essentially, some of the things that EMS personnel or pre-hospital personnel responding to dynamic incidents should be prepared to do. Okay, and it's important that you realize, like in dynamic incidences, yes, so there's some of the things that you will have to, a lot of it revolves around your own safety. So number one, of course, is ensure your own safety and establish a unified command. And this is where you're working hand in hand with the police. Previously, we've seen some people trying to do their own heroics, and that normally rubs the law enforcement in the wrong way. But so that's why you need to have a unified command with the police so that there's clear command and control of a situation. And of course, especially where security is a big issue. And security doesn't just extend to the victim, but your own safety. And no one needs to be a hero. No one needs to be a hero in this situation. And then, of course, you need to provide a situational awareness to the dispatch center to send additional units. This is where using bystanders to provide the care. So if you're one responder, you have multiple bystanders that you're holding a whole trauma bag full of bandages and gauze, then you can provide just-in-time instruction and say, if you see someone bleeding too much, apply bandage, strap that thing off, and then they'll be able to become then your helpers on the ground. So using a support body or immediate responders to help the victims as much as possible. Of course, also are willing to help is a situation you may need to deal with in a dynamic situation. Okay. And then integrating with law enforcement, I mentioned that, especially to rescue the victims and evacuate people from the scene. Okay. Directing patients to relative safety. Remember, especially in kind of terrorist attacks, and there's always a risk of secondary attacks. And so you must always be cognizant that it's a dynamic situation. It's a dynamic incident where the threat may not have been completely neutralized. And it could be even just a collapsed building, for example. Building has collapsed and then you're rushing in and the building collapses on you. So you must always be careful about secondary incidents. And of course, most of the patients are probably not going to get into your ambulance, okay? Again, directing the vehicles to the most appropriate hospital, and not even if it's not an ambulance, and telling them, this patient, what's wrong with the patient? They've got this, take them to this hospital. So that may be also a focus for you as a provider on the ground, okay? And then focus on rapid transport of casualties who are critically ill or critically injured, maybe the priority. So the red and yellow, of course, going to trauma centers, and not necessarily having, I don't know, a collection point first, then you categorize again, then it's load and go, okay? And then we'll discuss about EMS supporting the hospitals, because something that definitely comes in play. And that will probably come at the end of my presentation. So what are the basic steps of triage? Okay. Provider safety should be the first priority during any mass casualty operation. And the scene size up and request for resources as you get in. Remember, you want to know if it's a dynamic scene or it's a static scene. And then safe access to the victims, your safety and the safe access to the victim. teams. Then the next part of it is patient evacuation, okay? And then intervention to correct immediate life threats. So the immediate life threats, so is the priority, not, and we'll discuss what are these immediate life threats, okay? And provider safety should be the first priority during any MCI operations. Rescue task forces, appropriate equipment, minimizing on-scene operations, and reducing the vulnerability of yourself. So you don't want to spend the whole time on the scene. So getting patients out, movement and transport then becomes quite a priority. So in a mass casualty, and again, as the number of patients become overwhelming, so if you have few patients, then the focus will go to looking at assessing the patient and providing some initial care, then transporting the patient. But as the numbers of patients become overwhelming, providers should shift their focus to prioritize the assessment of victims with just potentially life-threatening effects rather than definitive care of the most critically injured patients. So as you can see, reevaluation, secondary transfer of patients to more appropriate healthcare facilities when necessary comes down the line. But the 5 key priority areas is scene size up and understand whether it's a static scene or a dynamic scene. How do you your safety, and how to safely access patients. Quick patient evaluation, and here you're prioritizing assessment of victims with potential life threats and looking for those, and then correcting those life threats, and then movement of the patient to the hospital. All right, so those are the basic steps. And so we'll look at what are the different types of triage. So there are 3 main levels of triage. There's primary triage, secondary triage, and tertiary triage in a mass casualty situation. Primary triage, which is the basic discussion around this presentation today, is what happens in a pre-hospital environment, but can also happen in the emergency department. Some patients, as I said, may quickly evacuate themselves or be evacuated by private vehicles. And that's why it's not always, most of our patients, especially mass casualty, are not necessarily appearing by ambulance, and no one has triaged them. So primary triage can easily happen in a pre-hospital environment, but also in a hospital environment. Now, secondary triage, similarly, which is interesting in our setting, can happen again in the pre-hospital environment or in the emergency department, and I'll explain. So sometimes there may be delays in transport, okay? There are not enough vehicles, it's a remote area, there are not enough ambulances, there's a delay of getting the patients out of the scene to the nearest hospital. In such a situation, then secondary triage would come in, where after initial primary triage, because the patient is still there, there'll be a bit of intervention and then reassessment and then retriaging of the patient. But again, there's very few validated models for secondary triage. A lot of the discussion has also been about primary triage because the priority is about always getting the patient to the hospital. And that's why, especially in situations where patients are taken from scene to hospital without any triage, some primary triage tools are definitely applied in the emergency department because this patient has not been triaged by anyone else, and thus is a need for us to look at quickly, providing that primary triage to them in the emergency department. But in a normal situation where primary triage happen in the pre-hospital environment, then secondary triage happens in the emergency department where the patients come in, and then we're looking at what has happened in between when they were triaged, during the ambulance, whatever interventions may have been done, and then reevaluation of the primary triage category after the additional assessment and interventions have been done. And then last part of is the tertiary triage. This one happens in the emergency department after you've intervened, you've gotten some results, and now you're looking at the patient again. Then that's where tertiary triage happens. But for our reference and for what you always need to know is primary triage can happen either pre-hospital or in the emergency department if the patient did not have any EMS access before that. And secondary triage similarly can happen in the pre-hospital environment if there's a delay in taking the patient to the hospital or in the emergency department, which is where normally it happens. Now, in terms of primary triage, and it's the focus we'll discuss right now, mainly around primary triage. Again, prioritizing leaving patients away from an unsafe area is the main thing of triage. First, you need to move patients away from an unsafe area, assess for life threats, and provide immediate treatment in an area of relative safety. So, and again, this will depend on how much time you have on scene. That assessment sometimes could happen en route to the hospital, but the first thing is, of course, moving them away from the unsafe area. Assess for life threats. We'll discuss what life threats are, and then providing immediate life-saving interventions. So not putting cannulas and things. Those are not life-saving interventions. And we'll discuss all the life-saving interventions. And again, remember, as I mentioned, the third part, again, the most important part of triage is beyond prioritization, identifying life threats and intervening for life threats, is transport. Transport decision making makes that difference because you need to make sure the patient gets to the appropriate hospital destination based on the injuries and then initial and additional treatment. So prioritize, assess, identify. Okay, identify the right hospital for the patient. As you notice, I'm not really talking about the tools. There are multiple triage tools out there, and we'll discuss where the science has shown evidence and no evidence. But in primary triage, your patient ends up in one of these 5 categories. Some don't have the expectant category, but essentially you have your immediate patients who need immediate treatment, delayed management, minimal care. These are normally your walking wounded, your minor injury patients, normally triaged green. Expectant. So expectant triage decisions are rarely made in the field during an MCI because systemic transport prioritization is rarely required. And usually we don't have a lot of information. So this whole expectant, it's normally, either they're dead or they're not dead. Okay. So it's rarely used in the field. And then, of course, then you have the dead category where you're either tagged black, blue. And so there has been an issue with black, especially black tape, and especially at night or low light conditions. Then that's where there's a move to more of the black white strips or zebra looking kind of reflective tape may be helpful. And you can use light sticks and other means of identifying the different kinds of patients. But yeah, black in the dark is usually a problem identifying. But yeah, so those are the main, whichever triage tool you're looking at, those are the main triage categories you're landing on. It's either red, yellow, green, or immediate, delayed, minimal, and dead. Expectant, rarely used. But in large aspects of it, this is the theory part of it. In a large situation, these are the 2 most important categories. Okay, you either need immediate help. Okay, so your priority, you're tagged red because you need immediate care, or you're dead. Okay, those are the 2 main categories. The yellow, green, remember, yellow, of course, can deteriorate and become red, but the 2 making a distinction between red and yellow casualties with penetrating torso trauma is not, especially someone who has maybe stabbed in the abdomen and then you're trying to determine are they red or are they yellow. A lot of that has been found to be very inaccurate. Yes, have been found to be very inaccurate, particularly in the base of field triage tools that may lack precision. May not be worthwhile investing in time trying to figure out yellow or red, especially where you have multiple casualties and a large number of casualties. So the key important part of it is identifying who is dead and who will die if you don't intervene immediately. That's your red category. And those are the most important ones. Everyone else pretty much takes a second step, or at least not a priority. So the most important part when you get to a scene is identifying who's a red and who's dead. Okay, so at least that way you're able to clear out and I'd prioritize the care for the immediate patients. Now, the next part of it is to tag or not to tag, okay? So a lot of this has been a discussion and we always get excited. I think a lot of us are really excited by these color tags and these tags for patients. So the use of tapes or tags may prove to be useless if the response is simply moving patients who are non-ambulatory straight into an ambulance, wherever it goes. So if your response is load, pick whichever patient you find, put them in the ambulance, send them away, okay? And tagging them is not really adding any value, okay? If that's your response, okay? If transport is immediately available for all these patients, then there's actually no benefit of tagging a patient. Because remember, the objective of prioritizing patients or putting triage tags is largely to make sure that you also prioritize their transportation out of the scene. But if you have 10 patients and you have 10 ambulances, then why are you putting tags? Just put everyone in an ambulance and send them to the hospital. Okay. So triage tags may have the greatest benefits in situations where transport is delayed, and in which case then you're doing secondary triage, and in which case the ability to record vital signs, medications given, interventions. Remember, the tag is not just about the color. There's actually space for you to write interventions, take a blood pressure, measure the pulse, measure the spirit, measure an SpO2. So that's a whole tag. So for you to use this tag appropriately, then you must have a lot of time. Okay. And that's why most of the time is if it's a mass casualty situation and you have multiple patients and you're just loading them and taking them into the ambulance, then by all means, there's no need to tag them. But if there's a delay in moving patients, for example, in a situation where you have multiple patients, but your transport is limited, then you need to tag your patients so that when the transport becomes available, those who are tagged red, for example, then are prioritized to get the transport. Okay, I hope that makes sense. That the tagging becomes important where you would be sitting with these patients on the scene for some time. Okay, but if the patients are pretty much loading and going, it's not like you don't go and say, wait, let's not move everyone, let's just start tagging. No. Move your patients. Tagging is only important if they can't move. Okay, to the next destination. This part was extensively covered in the video last week, and so I will not go into the exact details of the start triage, jumpstart triage, but I've highlighted the SALT triage, and I'll explain why we all should be using SALT. And there are many other triage tools, but some I think are the most common. But SALT triage is actually the one that has been now recommended. Okay, so there was a project where the triage figured out how to come up with standardized triage, because yes, there was confusion between START and SALT and I don't know, jumpstart, and I think there were many others that come. But so the model uniform core criteria for mass casualty incident triage, or MUCC, M-U-C-C, that's actually what it is. So it's a standard set of guidelines that all mass casualty triage systems should follow. It is not another triage method. So just do not get confused. We are not talking about having a new triage system. We already have enough, okay? But the criteria, and I'll just showcase what the criteria looks like, is a set of guidelines that all the stakeholders, of course, in the US, that's where most of these things come from anyway, but it's a process that's important. So they brought in all the stakeholders, healthcare providers, law enforcement people, disaster experts, and everyone. And through this whole process of consensus building to discuss how do we come up with a model uniform core criteria for mass casualty incident triage, or MUCC, okay? And the MUCC is intended to ensure consistency amongst responders when triaging patients at a mass casualty incident. So the triage method, for a triage method to be MUCC compliant or to be compliant with this criteria, it must satisfy 24 different criteria, and I'll go through some of these quickly. But these criteria are grouped into three main issues. It is global sorting, life-saving interventions, and then individual assessment. So let me see if I can share this. Yes. So again, this is you can get this document online, but we'll put it as part of the resources in the videos. So model uniform criteria for mass casualty incident triage guidelines. So they look at, as I said, it's general considerations, global sorting, life-saving interventions, and individual assessment. Like you mentioned, this is not a triage system. So do not confuse this with all the other triage systems. It's just a guide to say, if your system must comply to this criteria, okay? So general consideration, the triage system and all the components must apply to all ages and populations of the patients. So this is where the problems start, because remember, there's start and jump start. So automatically that criteria gets off, because you can't have providers trying to remember which one is adult, which one is pediatric, okay? And then must be applicable across a broad range of mass casualty incidents, in which there's a single location of multiple patients. So that's single incidents. Must be simple, easy to remember, amenable to quick memory aids. must be rapidly applied and practical for use in hostile environments, okay? So this has really limited some of the tools because I'm not sure how well you'll be able to count pulse rate or look for capillary refill as people are shooting at you, okay? So that's one of the things that they brought up. And then resource dependent, the system must allow for dynamic triage decisions based on changes in available resources, must require that the assigned triage category for each patient be visibly identified. So this is where the tags come in, or the caps or markers. It's dynamic and reflects patient condition and available resources at the time of assessment, okay? Assessments of, remember, I said triage is dynamic. So those are the general principles. And the global sorting, simple commands must be used initially to prioritize patients for individual assessment. First priority of individual assessments to identify those who are likely to need life-saving interventions. And they can easily be identified those unable to follow commands, purposeful movements, and no obvious threat to life, life-threatening external hemorrhage, or those who have obvious threat to life or life-threatening external hemorrhage. The second priority, so you can see this is a global sorting. So first priority is identify those who need life-saving interventions. Second priority is for individual assessment to identify those who are unable to follow command to the ambulate or to an assigned place, but are able to follow other commands, e.g. wave, make purposeful movement. So this is a global sorting. So first priority, those with life-threatening issues. Second priority, those are able to follow commands to ambulate, but can follow some simple commands. The last priority, of course, is those who follow commands and can walk around, have no obvious life-threatening conditions. Those ones are separated. Then all patients must be assessed individually, regardless of the initial prioritization during global sorting. This includes your green patients, your walking patients. So that's just sorting. So the first part of your triage process is the global sorting. Next part is life-saving interventions. So life-saving interventions are considered for each patient, provided as necessary, performed only if the equipment is readily available, and within the scope of practice of the individual, okay? So these are the life-saving interventions: controlling life-threatening external hemorrhage, opening the airway using basic maneuvers for an apneic child, considered 2 rescue breaths, performing chest decompression, providing an auto-injector antidote. So again, discusses a lot use of antidotes in patients with poisoning, for example, okay? So again, so it's global sort, life-saving interventions. So this is quickly looking at for each patient and providing these life-saving interventions. And then the last part of it is the individual assessment. So each patient must be assigned an individual triage category based on the criteria. The assessment must not require counting or timing vital signs. Instead, use yes or no criteria. So your tool must be as simple as using yes or no criteria. You do not need to have diagnostic equipment to use that triage tool. Capillary refill must not be used as a sole indicator for peripheral perfusion. We know how inaccurate that is. Patients who are not breathing after one attempt of open airway, children 2 rescues may be given, but must be classified as dead and visually identified as such. If the airway can't be open and they're not breathing, they're dead. Patient category as immediate, I'll just show you using the light, but essentially this is looking at now individual assessment of patients, okay? So there are 3 main categories, and I'll just go back to my presentation. So it's global sorting. So it's global sorting, life-saving interventions, individual assessment. So of all the triage tools I've mentioned, of all these 3 that we know about, the only one that meets the criteria is the salt triage. But there's also a principle that came from this discussion about just keeping triage simple, okay? A lot of them are very complicated. Capillary refill less than 20, or respiratory rate less than 29 breaths or more than 30 breaths. So a lot of that has been shown not to be really useful and does not meet the MARC criteria, okay? So triage essentially needs to be evidence-based, one size fits all, okay? All ages and all populations, all environments, whether it's hot, cold, lukewarm, must be easy to remember, and then easy to apply to all levels of providers, whether you're BLS, ILS, ALS. This triage cannot just be the preview of paramedics, for example, okay? All levels of providers must be able to use this triage. And then, of course, practical in a hostile environment. Hostile environments here, we're talking about shooting situations or where dynamic incidents where things are not settled and then must be flexible. Okay. So, like I mentioned, the only triage method which currently meets the MARC criteria is the SALT mass casualty triage. Okay. And it's again based on the arranged in the same way of global sorting. Okay. So you can see step one. This is where global sorting happens. Can you walk? You become priority 3. Green, can you wave or purposeful movement? You're second to be assessed. And are you still or obvious life threats? Then you're first to be assessed. Okay. So that's a global sorting. So it's just simply those who are walking, cap and then really those who can move your hands, show us where you are. Then the next one, those who are not moving, then become the people who are assessed first. Okay. Then the next part of it is life-saving individual assessment and life-saving interventions. Okay. And again, here you can see, then you're looking at control of major hemorrhage, opening the airway. In a child, you can give 2 breaths, chest decompression, auto-injector. It's that simple. Those are the life-saving interventions. And again, of course, within the scope of practice and available resources, if the patient starts breathing, what's this thing called? The detailed individual assessment, where they're obeying commands, make purposeful movements as a pay for pulse. Remember, you can see there's nowhere here and anyone is measuring anything. Okay. Major hemorrhage is controlled. Okay. So, and here we go. This is, and then if they're all yes, then your minor injury is only, you go there. If no, you're delayed. Likely to survive given current resources. So this actually brings in the third part of it, the part of availability of resources. If the patient will survive given the available resources, then they become alright. If not, then you're expectant. So versus the previous one where you went step by step giving color codes, as you can see here, the color codes come in last. Okay. They're more or less the end point of the process. So global sorting is just figure out who am I going to see first, who am I going to see second, who am I going to see third. Okay. So you separate them out. That's sorting them out. Then the next part of it is providing individual assessments now to each of these patients. And as you assess them, you're providing life-saving interventions for the patients immediately. Okay. So of course, you start with those with still or obvious life threat. Then you move to the wave or purposeful movement. Then you move to the third one. Okay. Of all the triage systems that meet the recommended now consensus-based guidelines of what we should be doing as prehospital mass casualty triage, then SALT is the one that is recommended right now because it meets all the criteria for the MARC criteria, model uniform core criteria. Okay. So remember, as now as you go through your triage process, then you have the interventions. There's a things like applying tourniquets to prevent catastrophic bleeding. There is basic positioning and intervention of the airway. And if that opens the airway, fine. If it doesn't, in a kid, you can give 1 breath or is it 2 breaths? In a kid, you can give 2 breaths and see if that works. In an adult, if the basic airway opening doesn't work, that's it for them. They're dead. Things like putting chest seals, chest decompression, and auto-injector antidotes. These are the only interventions. No IV lines, IV fluids. I don't know what other things people are doing in the pre-hospital. None of that, okay? Just life-saving interventions and move, keep it moving, okay? So next part of it, so after you've done your triage remember, in a dynamic situation, you're probably not even going through a lot of this. This is more in a static situation or a situation where you have the transport delays and you have time to go through a bit some of this, but some of this may actually be happening as you go in an ambulance. Now, remember, as I said, and I keep emphasizing that transport decision-making is part of the triage process, okay? In terms of what is the patient's condition, what is the treatment capacity of the closest center. If it's a health center, that's not going to help a patient with penetrating chest injury, but it could help a patient with minor cuts and bruises, for example. So, and then what transport resources are available, okay? So it's not always that you have to wait for ambulances or just look for ambulances. You could easily use whatever resources are available. Remember, the priority is to get the right patient to the right hospital at the in the fastest means possible, okay? If, for example, you showed up with an ambulance and you're the only crew there and most of the patients are red, for example, then you will not say you're going to be transporting them with the ambulance because it's an ambulance. Then you have to prioritize based on available transport. And then you prioritize your patients based on who's going the first vehicle, second vehicle, third vehicle, and where are they going. Important is also where are they going. Taking people to hospitals that are not well prepared could be detrimental to their care. Okay, so the goal of triage, and this is one thing that why we bother with the process, apart from, of course, wanting to save lives and ensure people are getting care appropriately. The main goal of doing proper triage is to avoid both over triage and under triage. Okay, the goal is to recognize, prioritize the critically ill, injured patients for care. Under triage is where you're placing a patient in a lower category than the actual injuries require. Okay, that means critically injured patients will not be recognized. Okay, so this is where you downgrade a patient's injuries and then they become critically ill later and potentially die. Over triage is where you're placing a patient in a high category other than the actual injuries. So, for example, if you end up with a lot of red patients and all of them have minor cuts and bruises, then that becomes a problem because then it diverts the assessment and treatment resources from those who actually need it most. Okay. So the objective of any triage system is, of course, recognizing and prioritize the critically ill and injured patients, but also avoid over triage and under triage. One aspect that needs to also be factored in is how does the EMS or pre-hospital healthcare providers support hospitals? Okay, EMS play a pivotal role in providing hospital triage, and especially a lot of the parking lot triage. So, because sometimes we'll have a lot of patients show up in the hospital and they're not coming by ambulance. No one has assessed them. They probably made their way to the hospital. And now we have shifted the primary triage zone from the pre-hospital environment to the parking lot of the emergency department. And EMS personnel can play a pivotal role in helping hospital personnel triage patients outside the doors of the emergency department, especially where pre-hospital triage was not done, which is most of our situations. So there is definitely a role for EMS to support patients within the support patients. This, of course, when you've finished your on-scene work and response and initial transport, then again, because you may have just been coming and dropping them off in the ED, and then they're just moving the chaos from point A to point B. There's a role for then EMS people to support emergency departments in providing potentially what would be primary triage or sometimes secondary triage at the doors of the emergency department. And then, of course, helping in transferring some of the patients from that facility, potentially to other facilities. The objective, and this is where we really want to work towards going all of us, is integrated healthcare and response system where the hospital, the EMS, the emergency management organizations, the public health agencies, everyone within a region is working harmoniously to respond to incidences where it's not just EMS by themselves and they're not even talking to the hospitals, or the fire and the police are not even talking to each other. So creating a unified system really will go a long way in improving our responses and ensuring that we're able to manage both static and dynamic incidences appropriately, and supporting people and saving more lives, for example. And the key thing when I say the same geographical area, of course, as we were looking at it in a Kenyan context, is at county level, at Nairobi city level, for example, or major city level, all players working together and having a combined response system that everyone knows what the pre-hospital response triage, for example, is. Police, fire, hospital, ambulances, all of them working as one to respond to incidents. And that's it. I see a lot of CPD questions. Remember, CPD things can be, if you reach out to Daktari online, they will mention to where their CPD's points are. And maybe before I take any questions from everyone, Lily, you want to answer on all these CPD discussions?
Yes, let me do that. So regarding CPD, this event is accredited for KMPDC, COC, and NCK members. So that's doctors, nurses, and clinical officers. For KMPDC members, we post your tokens on Daktari online profile. So once you just log in, you'll see a tokens tab, and we send these instructions via email. And we've sent all the token numbers for doctors. So in case you haven't received yours, feel free to reach out to us on daktarionline@gmail.com. For clinical officers and NCK members, Your council has told us that we'll be able to get the events approved soon. We posted them as programs, and that's why they've taken a bit of time. So once we get the approval from them, for COC members, you'd need to subscribe, and the token numbers will be generated from there, and then you'll receive them. And for NCK members, you'll receive a secret code. So the holdup is from the council side for the clinical officers and the nurses.
Thank you very much. There's a question. Someone who has a problem logging into your portal. Hopefully you can help them out. Are there any special instructions to logging into the Dr. Online portal?
No, it's straightforward. You just have to log in with your email and your password. But feel free to reach out to us on the contact number. You'll find it on the profile in case you have a challenge.
All right, thank you. So just to summarize in terms of what are the basic steps of triage, Prehospital Mass Casualty Triage essentially synthesize up and request for resources, safe access to the victims, patient evaluation, intervention to correct immediate life threats, as we've discussed, movement to transport, okay? Getting the patient to the appropriate transport and transporting the patient to the most appropriate hospital. Those are the basic steps of triage. The validated triage tool that we currently are using and should be migrating to is the Salt Triage, okay? Where's the slide on Salt Triage? Yes, there we go. Yes, so your Salt Triage again, so global sorting, life-saving interventions, individual assessment. So just think about it that way. There are three main processes: global sorting, life-saving interventions, individual assessments. All right. Cool. Remember these videos. So this ends our triage series. So you can catch all 4 episodes that we've done this month on Dr. Online on our YouTube channel. Most videos should be up by the end of next week. You can catch any episode that you missed. And again, feel free to shoot us an email in terms of in case it's something specific you want to discuss. We probably will do another series down the year. We'll decide what exactly we'll be doing. But for next month, we'll be having the game show. Yes, I think we're having the emergency game show. You have a chance to win so last Thursday of the month, that will be last Thursday of July. Come ready with your brains all sharpened up. There'll be lots of prizes to be won. And yes, thank you very much. Hope you've enjoyed the series. And in case you have any comments, questions, or any feedback to us, always feel free to contact us. Thank you.